Hey, Joe here from Home Studio Corner. We're going to talk about something more basic today because I got a question about it asking what are subgroups? Well, let's talk about that. When you're opening up your recording software, it behaves very similarly to an actual analog Mackie mixer. If you ever walked up to a big mixer at your church or at a venue, especially the analog ones, you'll see there's a bunch of channels, and then usually there are some red faders in the middle or to the right. They may be red, they may be blue. They're usually a different color from the channel faders, and they're called subgroups. What those are used for usually is to allow you to send certain groups of channels to different faders. So I could take all of my drums and route them to a single fader. So now when I move this fader, I'm turning the overall drum mix up and down. I can adjust the individual levels, how loud the snare is relative to the kick, but then I can move the entire fader by itself and adjust my overall drum volume. You can do the same thing in your recording software. But it goes further with the recording software because you're not limited to the physical number of subgroups on your mixer. On an analog mixer, you might have, say, 4 subgroups, and then maybe you have 4 auxes. You remember how mixers have all those knobs? One knob at the top is for the preamp. A few knobs are for the EQ. It may have a compressor on there depending on the mixer. And then it usually has a row of auxiliary send knobs, which means I can take my lead vocal and I can send some of it to the lead vocalist's floor wedge. Then I can send some of it to the drummer's wedge. I can send some of it to the bass player, and each person can get their own mix. That's what those auxes were for. Those auxes are actually a form of a bus. A bus is just anything that takes audio from one place to another. Think of it like a literal bus. You sit at the bus stop and it takes you from one place to another. There are lots of bus stops. There are lots of different buses that go in lots of different places. Audio is the same way. We've got to get audio from this microphone out to the drummer. How are we going to do that? We're going to use a series of buses to get us there. In this instance, we might turn up the auxiliary on this vocal channel for aux 4 because that's the one that's feeding the drummer's mix. And now I turn that up and now he can hear me better. We've utilized an aux or a bus to accomplish that. Let me show you what that looks like in the software. It's actually really easy, but if you've never done it before, you may not know this is available to you and it'll rock your world. So here inside of Studio One, I've got a set of drum tracks that I recorded. Now let's say I'm mixing along, I've got a good balance, and I think, man, it'd be nice to have a single fader for this overall drum mix. Maybe I could even put an EQ on the overall drum mix. That would be great. Well, the way you do that, when you open up your session and have files in it, the way it defaults, if you look here, this top row is the inputs, the bottom row is the output for each channel, and it will default to everything going to the main output. Now, if you'll notice on the right-hand side of my mix, there is a main output or a master fader. Studio One, that's included. It's always there. You can't get rid of it, which is fine. And systems like Pro Tools, sometimes that's something you have to add in. But everything defaults to going out the main outputs of your audio interface. That's sort of the default bus, if you will. If you hear people talking about the mix bus, it's this right here, this red track on the far right-hand side. I can add compression and EQ there. If someone says I put a compressor on my mix bus, or they talk about 2-bus compression, they're talking about putting a compressor there and compressing the entire mix. But we want a bus just for our drums. Let's say we got a big rock mix. I need my drums on their own bus. Well, all we have to do is create a new track called a bus. In Pro Tools, it's called an aux. Different systems, it can be called different things. That's what makes it so confusing. It is essentially just a bus or an aux track, any number of names. So here we can say, add a bus channel. Now, I've got this cute little gray channel. I can call it drums, but right now nothing is going to this bus. It's just sitting by itself being unused. We have to route all these drums to that bus. So I select them all, I click on the output, and instead of it going to the main output like it was, we're now going to go to this bus that I created called drums. Now, all of these tracks are routed through this bus. I can move this fader, and it controls the overall level of the mix, and then I can add plugins to this bus, such as EQ and compression, which is a great idea on drums, to sweeten the overall sound of the drum kit. And we can do that for any number of tracks in your system. That's the beauty of a digital system. You can do this all day long. Now, don't do it all day long because you'll be wasting your time, but do it when you need it. It's a valuable tool. Where else would I use subgroups? I'll tell you where else. I've got 2 kick drum mics. I'd like to have a single fader for both. I'm going to right click here and I'm going to say add bus for selected channels. Now watch this. This is cool. Studio One creates the bus and automatically routes them to it. So these two tracks are now going to this bus I'll call kicks, and I'll spell it with a J because I'm cool. And now I have a single fader for my kick drums. Can do the same thing for my snare drums. Add bus for selected channels. Boom. We're going to call this bus snares. Same thing. I could even do it for my toms. This is actually what I do in a lot of mixes because I want to process these things together because it just makes more sense. Now, I know this may seem complicated if you've never done this before, but let me quickly go through the routing here. We essentially have 5 buses in our session right now. We'll go from the end, the finish line, back to the beginning. The first bus is our main bus. This is our mix bus. This is the Big Daddy-O track. Everything goes through here before we hear it. This is our main master fader, the main fader on your mixer. This is it. This is the one that controls the volume of everything. Everything has to come through here. From there, we come back to a drum bus. This bus is feeding the main output, so it's going to that main output, but it stands alone by itself. Okay? Now, feeding into the drum bus, we have several elements there. Individual drum tracks like the overhead, this fat channel, trash track, and a stairwell room mic track. Those are all going to my drum bus, in addition to these 3 buses here. Now, you remember, I just created these. This is for my kick drums, my snare drums, and my tom drums. Those are all being fed like this. These 2 channels go into this channel. This one goes into the drum bus goes into the main bus. These 2 go into the snare drum channel goes into the drum channel over into the main bus. An important thing to note, if we look back over in this window where it just shows us our audio tracks, it looks no different than when we started. Why? Because we haven't created new audio tracks in our session. We've just created under the hood buses that will allow us to route our audio tracks. You usually don't see buses show up here because they're not tracks that you can record to. They're just something that you can send your audio through once it's been recorded. So this window looks different from this one because we've got some extra things in place. Now, some systems will show the buses up here. I used to not like that Studio One did this, but I actually kind of like it now. On this window, I have just the tracks, the audio tracks themselves. Here, I have a bigger picture where I can see where I've got everything routed. Okay, does that make sense? Now, the only kind of to throw a wrench in the plans is we talked about there can be things called effects channels or effects buses or aux buses that you put reverbs and delays on. You'll notice, look at these 2 here, right next to each other. What's the difference? The only difference, other than that the solo is green, I can talk about that another day. The only difference is this effects channel allows for plugins but no sends. So, for example, if I wanted to take my drum mix and send it to a reverb, I could do that. I could set up a reverb channel and I could send the overall drum mix to that reverb. But if this was the reverb channel that drum mix is coming into, I can't then send the reverb somewhere else. A lot of times you might not want to do that anyway, so this is saving on some processing by just having a regular old bus with no ability to do extra sending. So there's essentially 2 sets of outputs on a channel. You've got the main output, so this kick drum track. There's the main output, which right now is feeding our kick drum bus. But then there is a send section, which means I can send a copy of this kick drum somewhere else if I wanted to another bus perhaps, to some sort of effects bus, or to some other subgroup. The possibilities are limitless, which, as you can hopefully start to see, you could get really creative in how you're mixing things. You could send the kick drum through your drum bus and then send it through another bus that just processes it in a different way to make it really snappy sounding. Blend that with the overall drum mix to get a big, thick kick drum and a snappy kick drum. A lot of parallel processing options here. That's getting way more advanced than I really wanted to in this video. Just know this, a bus is a tool that usually has a fader attached to it that will allow you to transfer these signals from here to there. And the bus is the go-between that allows you to do that. All right, that's it. If you have questions, if I wasn't clear, which is certainly possible, leave a comment below with your question and I'll be sure to try to answer that for you. Otherwise, if you really do like mixing and you like being efficient and you like getting your mixes done faster and better, check out my 5-step mix guide at 5stepmix.com. Super great, super short, and it'll help you get better. All right, that's it for me. See ya.